You're off the flight. Effective immediately. Marin Caldwell said it loudly enough for the crew room to hear. Graham Mercer stood beside the operations desk, still wearing his Navy pilot uniform, his flight badge clipped neatly beneath the company insignia. Around him, two first officers stopped talking. A dispatcher looked down at his monitor. Someone near the coffee machine went very still. Graham glanced at the report in Marin's hand. That report isn't complete. It has your signature. My signature is on the original report. Marin's expression didn't change, and the company has determined that you falsified it. Graham looked at her for a moment. He could have argued. He could have raised his voice. Instead, he unclipped his badge. Do I get a copy? He asked. Marin hesitated for half a second. You should have thought about that before you signed it. Graham placed the badge on the counter and walked away. He had no idea that, less than 2 minutes later, a voice inside the airport tower would ask for him by a name almost nobody there had heard in years. If you're watching, tell me how old you are, where you're watching from, and whether you've ever been blamed for something you knew wasn't the whole story. Outside the terminal, the October air was cold enough to make Graham pull the zipper of his jacket higher. He crossed the employee parking lot without looking back. His flight bag felt heavier than usual, even though nothing inside it had changed. At 38, Graham had learned that losing a job was not the same thing as losing yourself. But he also knew exactly what this job meant. It paid the mortgage on the small house where his 8-year-old son, Eli, waited for him every afternoon. It paid for school lunches, groceries, and the endless little things that came with raising a child alone. More than that, flying was the one part of his life he had never had to explain to Eli. His son simply understood that Dad flew airplanes and always came home. Graham reached his truck and sat behind the wheel. His phone showed 3 missed calls from school, then one message from Eli. Are you picking me up today? Graham stared at the screen. He typed yes. I'll be there. Then he stopped before sending it. His eyes moved to the company badge lying on the passenger seat. The accusation still bothered him, but not because it might cost him his job. Something in the report was wrong. He had seen it before. The order of events didn't make sense. Graham started the engine. He would deal with the firing later. First, he had a son waiting at school. And somewhere inside the airport he had just left, a tower controller was about to say 2 words that would change the meaning of everything. Viper 1. By the time Graham pulled into the elementary school parking lot, the afternoon pickup line had already thinned out. Eli was sitting on the low brick wall near the front office, backpack between his shoes, watching every car that came through the gate. Graham saw him before Eli saw him. He stayed behind the wheel for a moment, rubbing one hand over his jaw. He had rehearsed several explanations during the drive. None of them sounded right. When Eli finally spotted the truck, his face changed immediately. He jumped down from the wall and ran over. You're early. Graham opened the passenger door, trying something new. Eli climbed in and buckled his seatbelt. He looked at his dad's uniform. Then at the empty space where Graham's badge normally Saturday. Did something happen? Graham started the engine. A work problem. Are you still a pilot? The question was quiet. Graham glanced at him in the mirror. I'm still a pilot. It was true, at least for the moment. He just didn't know what the company intended to do with that fact. They stopped at a grocery store on the way home. Graham bought chicken, bread, milk, and the cereal Eli liked, even though it cost almost twice as much as the store brand. At the checkout, his phone vibrated. An email from Human Resources. Subject, Employment Review. Graham didn't open it. Not yet. At home, he changed out of his uniform and hung it carefully inside the bedroom closet. He put on dark jeans, a gray Henley, and an old brown canvas jacket. Outside, the October light was already fading. Eli sat at the kitchen table doing math homework while Graham cooked dinner. For a few minutes, the house felt normal. Then Eli looked up. Dad, yeah. Did somebody get mad at you? Graham turned the burner down. Why? Because when people get fired on TV, somebody's usually mad. Graham almost smiled. This wasn't TV. Eli returned to his homework. Okay, that was all. But the silence afterward stayed with Graham. Later that evening, after Eli went upstairs, Graham finally opened the email. The company had placed the termination decision on administrative hold pending review, but the original accusation remained in his personnel file. He read the report again. The language was clean, professional, almost harmless. That was what bothered him. It made the whole thing sound simple. It said he had received an operational instruction, refused to comply, and then submitted a report that failed to accurately describe his actions. Graham leaned back in his chair. He remembered the cockpit, the radio, the exact sequence. He remembered asking for clarification before acknowledging anything. He remembered the controller's reply. He remembered the time displayed on the system. The report had changed something, not the facts themselves. The order. Graham opened a drawer and took out a small plastic case. Inside was an old aviation badge, scratched around the edges from years of use. The printed letters had faded, but one word was still visible. Viper. Graham turned it over. A second marking sat beneath it, 01. He stared at it for a few seconds, then closed the case. He had not thought about that call sign in years. Upstairs, Eli called goodnight. Graham put the case back in the drawer. Good night, buddy. Then he looked at the termination report again. This time, he reached for a blank sheet of paper. At the top, he wrote 4 words. What happened first? Graham had written the same question 3 times before he realized he was circling it. What happened first? He drew a line beneath it, closed the notebook, and went upstairs. By morning, the question was still there. 3 days earlier, the flight had looked routine. Graham had arrived before sunrise, wearing his Navy uniform and a charcoal wool coat against the cold October wind. The operations floor smelled of coffee and printer paper. Dispatchers were already moving between screens, checking weather, fuel, crew assignments, and aircraft status. Graham liked mornings like that. There was something honest about a day that had not gone wrong yet. His first officer, Marcus Bell, was younger and still carried a little too much energy into the cockpit. Graham had learned not to discourage it. You sleep at all? Graham asked. Marcus smiled. 4 hours. Luxury. They reviewed the flight plan and headed toward the aircraft. Nothing seemed unusual until dispatch sent a revised operational instruction less than 20 minutes before departure. Graham read it once. Then again. One number didn't match the aircraft configuration record in front of him. It wasn't dramatic. No warning light. No emergency. Just a discrepancy between what the dispatch system said and what the maintenance record showed. Graham called operations. Can you confirm revision 3? He asked. The dispatcher checked his screen. That's the current version. I'm looking at a different configuration entry. It may be an older record. Graham looked at the timestamp. It was updated 12 minutes ago. There was a pause. I'll check. Graham waited. Marcus watched him. Problem? Not yet. A minute later, the dispatcher came back and told him the instruction was valid. Graham still wasn't satisfied. He asked for the clarification to be entered into the operational record before he acknowledged it. That was when Maren Caldwell joined the call. The CEO rarely involved herself in routine flight operations, which made her appearance noticeable. Her voice came through the speaker, calm and controlled. Captain Mercer, we are already behind schedule. I understand. Then acknowledge the instruction. Graham looked at the screen. I can acknowledge the instruction after the discrepancy is resolved. Silence followed. Marcus shifted in his seat. Graham knew exactly how it sounded. A pilot slowing down an operation. A pilot making a simple problem bigger than it needed to be. But he had spent too many years learning that the dangerous part of a small discrepancy was not the discrepancy itself. It was the moment everyone decided it was too small to matter. Maren came back on the line. Are you refusing a direct instruction? Graham kept his voice level. No. I'm asking for confirmation before I sign my name to it. We don't have time for this. Then give me the confirmation. The call ended. The flight was delayed. No one was hurt. No emergency was declared. By the end of the morning, the aircraft was back in service. Graham assumed the matter would be reviewed and closed. He was wrong. That afternoon, a report appeared in the system. It described Graham as having refused an operational instruction and failed to provide an accurate account of the incident. Graham opened the document and felt something tighten in his chest. The words looked official. The sequence looked clean. Too clean. He scrolled to the bottom. His name was there beside a signature from the original report. He stared at it. He knew what he had signed. And it was not this. The report was waiting for Graham when he arrived at the company office the next morning. He had changed out of his uniform before leaving home. Navy trousers and a white shirt had been replaced by dark jeans, a gray sweater, and the same brown canvas jacket he had worn the night before. He looked less like a pilot that way. That seemed appropriate. He was no longer being treated like one. Maren Caldwell was already in the conference room. She sat at the far end of the table with a tablet in front of her. Beside her were the head of operations, a human resources manager, and a company attorney Graham had seen only once before. No one offered coffee. Marin looked up. Captain Mercer. Good morning. Please sit. Graham took the chair nearest the door. The attorney slid a folder toward him. This is the preliminary findings, he said. Graham opened it. The first page repeated the same claim he had read the night before. He had received a direct operational instruction. He had refused to comply. He had then submitted a report that did not accurately reflect his actions. Graham turned the page. Where is the original radio transcript? The operations director answered. It's attached in the appendix. Graham flipped to the back. It was there. He read it once. Then again. The words were familiar, but something was missing. Who prepared this version? The operations director frowned. The operations review team. Which version? The final version. That wasn't my question. The room became quiet. Graham pointed to the transcript. This isn't the sequence I heard. Marin leaned back. Captain, we've reviewed the recording. You reviewed a transcript. The recording supports the report. Then the recording should support the sequence. Marin's expression tightened. You delayed a flight over a discrepancy that operations had already determined was harmless. I asked for confirmation. You refused to acknowledge the instruction. Because the configuration record didn't match the dispatch instruction. The attorney looked down at his notes. Marin folded her hands. Do you understand the position you're putting the company in? Graham looked at her. I understand the position I'm in. That answer seemed to irritate her more than an argument would have. She pushed a second document across the table. This is your original report. Graham recognized his signature immediately. He read the first paragraph, then stopped. I didn't write this. The HR manager spoke carefully. Your signature is on the document. I know. You signed the report. I signed the original report. Marin's voice became colder. So you're saying someone altered it? Graham looked back at the page. I don't know what happened. Then what exactly are you accusing us of? I'm not accusing anyone. He closed the folder. I'm saying I don't know what happened yet. For the first time, Marin looked genuinely frustrated. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. Graham walked out without raising his voice, but he could feel the weight of the decision before anyone said it. His badge was collected before lunch. His access to the operations system disappeared by 2 in the afternoon. By 3, the company had sent a notice to the crew. Graham read it from his phone while sitting in his truck. It didn't mention the report. It didn't mention the discrepancy. It simply said he was no longer employed by the company. At 4:30, he picked up Eli from school. His son climbed into the truck, dropped his backpack on the floor, and looked at him. You're not wearing your uniform. No, are you off today? Graham started the engine. Something like that. Eli watched him for a moment. Did they fire you? Graham didn't answer immediately. Then he nodded. Yeah. Eli looked down at his shoes. Are you going to be okay? Graham looked through the windshield at the line of cars leaving the school. I don't know yet. It was the first completely honest answer he'd given all day. That night, after Eli went to bed, Graham opened his notebook again. At the top of the page was the question he had written the night before. What happened first? Under it, he wrote 3 words. Report. Recording. Timestamp. Then he stopped. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Graham stared at it before answering. A man's voice came through, quiet and professional. Captain Mercer? Yes. This is Daniel Price from the tower. Graham sat straighter. Daniel continued. I don't know what you've been told. A pause. But I think you need to hear the original transmission. Graham looked toward the closed bedroom door, then back at the phone. Why? Daniel took a breath. Because the timestamp on the copy I was shown doesn't match the one in our system. Graham said nothing. Daniel lowered his voice. And there's another problem. What problem? I heard someone ask for you on the frequency yesterday. Graham's eyes moved to the drawer where he had put the old badge. They didn't use your name. He waited. They called you Viper 1. Graham drove to the airport before sunrise the next morning, but he didn't go inside. He parked on the public side of the terminal and waited in his truck with the heater running. November was still a few weeks away, but the October cold had settled in early, the kind that made the windshield turn gray before the sun came up. Daniel Price had asked him to meet at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the tower. Graham arrived first. Daniel came in wearing a dark airport jacket, carrying no folder and no laptop. He looked like a man who had spent the morning deciding how much he was willing to say. You understand this conversation can't go through company channels, Daniel said. I figured. Daniel sat across from him. I pulled the archive tower recording last night. And the transmission is there. Graham waited. It happened 47 seconds earlier than the time shown on the company copy. Graham looked down at the table. 47. Exactly. That could be a synchronization problem. It could. Daniel took a sip of coffee. But there's something else. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket and placed it on the table. It wasn't an official document. Just a handwritten sequence of times. Graham read it. Tower transmission. System handoff. Dispatch update. Cockpit acknowledgement. The order was wrong. He looked up. Where did you get this? I wrote it down while listening to the original recording. Graham studied the page again. Why didn't the company get this version? Daniel gave him a tired look. I don't know. That answer bothered Graham more than if Daniel had blamed someone. Graham took out his phone. Can you send me the original recording? No, why not? I'm not authorized to release it. Graham nodded. Then what can you tell me? Daniel leaned back. The company copy isn't fake. Graham looked at him. That's important. It means somebody didn't necessarily change the words. They may have changed the sequence. Graham felt the same tightness return to his chest. That was the distinction he had been trying to describe since the first meeting. The report didn't have to contain invented facts. It only had to put real facts in the wrong order. Daniel lowered his voice. There's one more thing. When the tower pulled the archive, the system flagged one transmission as a duplicate. Graham frowned. Which one? The transmission immediately before your acknowledgement. Was it a duplicate? I don't know. Why? Because the audio doesn't sound duplicated. Graham sat back. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Outside the window, traffic moved toward the airport. Shuttle buses came and went. Employees crossed the sidewalk in jackets and uniforms, carrying coffee into the cold. Graham looked at the handwritten timeline. What happens if that transmission isn't a duplicate? Daniel shook his head. Then your report doesn't just have a missing detail. He tapped the paper. The sequence changes. Graham folded the page carefully. Can you put that in writing? Daniel hesitated. If I do, I become part of the review. You already are. Daniel gave a small, humorless smile. That's what I'm afraid of. Graham understood. He wasn't the only person who could lose something. A few minutes later, Daniel left. Graham stayed at the table. He opened the company report on his phone and read the same 3 lines again. Instruction received. Instruction refused. Pilot submitted an accurate report. The language was simple. Almost too simple. He opened a blank note and began rebuilding the timeline from memory. Then he added Daniel's information. The first timestamp. The second. The handoff. The acknowledgement. He stopped when he reached the transmission marked duplicate. There was no proof yet. Only a question. But for the first time since Marin had taken his badge, Graham felt something other than anger. He felt direction. That afternoon, he called the number Daniel had given him. I need access to the original records, Graham said. The person on the other end asked, why? Graham looked at the handwritten timeline sitting beside his coffee. Because someone decided what happened before they figured out when it happened. He ended the call. At home that evening, Eli was building a model airplane at the kitchen table. Graham set his jacket over a chair. Dad, yeah. Are you going back to work? Graham looked at the half-built airplane in his son's hands. I don't know. Eli nodded. Are you trying to? Graham thought about the report. The missing sequence. The 47 seconds. No, he said. I'm trying to find out what actually happened. Eli went back to the model. Graham opened his notebook. Under what happened first, he added one more line. Find the original record. The first thing Graham noticed about the archive room was how ordinary it looked. No dramatic security doors. No rows of flashing screens. Just a narrow office behind the airport operations. Center, 2 aging monitors, a printer that made a grinding sound every time it woke up, and a wall clock that was almost 3 minutes slow. Daniel had arranged for Graham to review the records through an independent safety liaison, which meant Graham could look but could not remove anything from the system. That was fine. He had stopped looking for something he could take home. He needed something that could survive being questioned. The liaison, a woman named Teresa Vaughn, sat beside him while the original tower audio played through headphones. Graham listened without moving. A controller gave a clearance. Another voice acknowledged something. There was a brief burst of static. Then the system handoff. Graham raised one finger. Back. Teresa rewound it. He listened again. Again. The third time, Graham leaned toward the screen. That's not a duplicate. Teresa looked at him. How can you tell? Listen to the background. She played it once more. Beneath the voices was the faint sound of an alert tone, followed by a controller speaking to another aircraft. Graham pointed at the waveform. The background changes. Teresa studied the recording, meaning, if this were a duplicate of the next transmission, the background would match. It doesn't. Teresa sat back. So the archive contains two separate transmissions. Yes. But the company report identifies one as a duplicate. Graham nodded. That's what it says. She opened the dispatch record. The timestamp was there. 47 seconds later than the tower archive. Graham looked from one screen to the other. There. Teresa frowned. What? The handoff. He zoomed in. Look at the system state. The display showed a brief transition between two communication channels. It lasted less than a minute. During that window, the operational display used one clock reference while the archive tower system used another. Graham stared at it. He felt the pieces moving, but not yet fitting together. So the 47 seconds aren't necessarily a mistake. Teresa shook her head slowly. They could be two different system clocks. Exactly. Graham reached for the notebook he had been allowed to bring. Then the question isn't which timestamp is correct. Teresa looked at him. What's the question? Graham wrote slowly. Which timestamp was used when the company reconstructed the incident? He underlined it. Teresa opened the internal review file. The preliminary report had been built from the dispatch system. Graham already knew that. What he didn't know was whether anyone had compared it against the archive tower system before the report was finalized. Teresa searched the attachments. Nothing. She searched the review notes. Still nothing. There's no cross-check, she said. Graham looked at her. You're sure? I don't see one. He leaned back. The room suddenly felt smaller. This was not the clean discovery he had expected. There was no smoking gun. No altered recording. No obvious lie. There was something more frustrating. A gap. Someone had taken one set of records and built a complete story from it without checking whether another system recorded the same event differently. Graham looked at the report again. It had never said the tower archive had been reviewed. It simply stated that the sequence was established. Who approved this? He asked. Teresa turned the screen toward him. Marin Caldwell's name appeared at the bottom of the approval chain. Graham stared at it. For a moment, the old anger returned. Then he pushed it aside. Anger wouldn't fix a timestamp. It wouldn't make a missing comparison appear. What happens now? Teresa asked. Graham closed the notebook. Now we find out who had access to both records. He stood. Before leaving, he glanced at the screen one more time. The archive transmission still sat there, 47 seconds apart from the company version. Two clocks, two records, one event, and somewhere between them, a decision had been made about what Graham had supposedly done. That was the first real change in the case. Until that morning, Graham had been trying to prove that the accusation was wrong. Now he understood something different. The accusation had been built from a sequence that might never have been properly established in the first place. He walked back toward the terminal wearing his brown canvas jacket, the cold air coming through the automatic doors each time someone entered. His phone buzzed. Daniel had sent one message. They've asked why you're looking into the archive. Graham stopped beneath the departure board. A second message followed. Marin knows. Graham looked up at the flights leaving that evening. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about getting his job back. He was thinking about what would happen if the company discovered that its version of the incident had been wrong before anyone outside the building ever saw it. Graham put the phone away. He had spent 3 days being told to defend himself. Now he had a better question. Who had decided there was nothing left to investigate? By Monday morning, Marin Caldwell had stopped asking whether Graham Mercer was trying to get his job back. The question had become something else. Why had no one compared the tower archive with the dispatch record before she signed the termination? She sat alone in her office with both versions open on her screen. The difference was small. 47 seconds. A handoff. One transmission marked duplicate. Nothing that looked important until the sequence was placed in the right order. Her operations director, Neil Harper, stood across from her desk. The original review team followed the standard process. Marin looked up. Did they? They used the approved report. That's not what I asked. Neil hesitated. They used the dispatch record. And the tower archive? It wasn't requested. Marin leaned back. Why? Neil didn't answer. That silence bothered her more than an excuse would have. Across town, Graham was sitting in a small conference room with Teresa Vaughn and an independent safety counsel. His notebook was open between them. He had drawn a simple line across the page and marked each event in sequence. The transmission happened here, Graham said. The system handoff happened here. The dispatch revision came after that. The counsel studied the notes. And your original report? I wrote that the instruction needed confirmation. I never wrote that I refused a confirmed instruction. Who changed the report? Graham shook his head. I don't know. Do you think someone changed it intentionally? Graham paused. I think that's the wrong question. Teresa looked at him. What's the right one? What version did everyone believe they were reading? Nobody spoke for a moment. That was the problem. The report might not have been deliberately falsified by one person. It might have passed through several hands until nobody remembered where the original meaning had changed. The counsel requested the audit trail. 2 hours later, they had it. The original report had been uploaded at 6:14 p.m. A revised version appeared at 7:03. Between those times, the operations supervisor had opened the document, added a paragraph, and forwarded it to executive review. Graham read the new paragraph twice. It described his refusal as deliberate. There, he said. Teresa pointed to the screen. That's the change. Graham nodded. Now we need to know what the supervisor believed he was correcting. At the same time, Marin received the same audit trail. She read the added paragraph and remembered the meeting with Graham. She remembered his exact words. The sequence isn't complete. She had interpreted them as defiance. Now they sounded different. Not an admission. A warning. Marin picked up her phone and called the tower. I need to speak with Daniel Price. Daniel answered several minutes later. Yes, ma'am. When you heard the original transmission, did you believe Graham Mercer was refusing an instruction? Daniel was quiet. No. Marin closed her eyes for a moment. Why didn't anyone tell me that? Because nobody asked us to interpret the sequence. We were asked to confirm the transcript. Marin looked at the two reports on her desk. For the first time, the decision she had made in public seemed less like a conclusion and more like a question she had answered too quickly. Daniel added, There's something else you should know. Marin waited. The call sign you heard mentioned yesterday wasn't random. She looked toward the airport beyond the glass. What is Viper 1? Daniel paused. You should probably hear that from the original records. The review room was smaller than Graham expected. There were no executives standing around, no cameras, and no audience waiting for someone to win. Just a long table, a screen on the wall, and 4 people who had spent the previous 2 days trying to answer one question. What actually happened? Graham sat at one end with Teresa and the independent safety counsel. Marin sat across from him. The door closed quietly behind the last person to enter. On the screen was the original tower recording. Daniel Price stood near the controls. We'll go through it in sequence, he said. No conclusions until the full timeline is visible. Graham folded his hands. He had imagined this moment many times. In some versions, he argued. In others, he told Marin exactly what he thought of her decision. Now that the room was real, none of that seemed useful. Daniel played the first transmission. A controller spoke. Another aircraft checked in. Then came the instruction Graham had been asked to acknowledge. The recording continued. The system handoff appeared 47 seconds later on the company timeline, but the tower archive showed it differently. Teresa placed both timestamps on the screen. 2 clocks, she said. 1 event. Daniel played the disputed transmission again. Static. A short alert tone. Another controller speaking in the background. Then Graham's voice. Calm. Precise. Confirm the configuration before I acknowledge. Marin looked toward him. That's not what the report says. Graham didn't answer. The next recording played. The dispatch revision appeared after Graham's request for confirmation. Then came the cockpit acknowledgement. The room went quiet. The counsel looked at the audit trail. The sequence in the preliminary report is reversed. Neil Harper, the operations director, shifted in his chair. The report was based on the dispatch system. And the tower archive? The counsel asked. It wasn't included in the original review. Marin looked at him. Why? Neil swallowed. We thought the dispatch record was sufficient. Graham finally spoke. That's what I was trying to tell you. Marin looked directly at him. For a moment, neither said anything. Then Daniel opened another file. There's one more piece. On the screen appeared the old Aviation records connected to Graham's name. A faded designation sat beside his training history. Viper 01. Marin stared at it. What is that? Daniel answered. An old incident reconstruction call sign. Graham completed the program years ago. The qualification trained pilots to analyze communication records, system handoffs, and timing discrepancies after operational incidents. Marin looked back at Graham. You knew about the timestamp problem. I knew the sequence didn't make sense. And you didn't tell anyone about this qualification? Nobody asked. Daniel continued. That's why the tower recognized the call sign. When the archive was pulled, one of the controllers remembered it. Marin looked down at the termination report. The words seemed smaller now. She turned to the council. What would the correct finding be? He answered without hesitation. That the termination decision was based on an incomplete reconstruction of the incident. Marin took a breath. She could still protect the company. She could say the decision was reasonable based on what they knew. She could call it a procedural mistake and move on. Instead, she looked at Graham. I was wrong. Graham said nothing. Marin continued. I fired you in front of the crew because I believed the report gave me the whole story. It didn't. The room stayed silent. Then she signed the correction. The personnel record will be amended. The preliminary report will be withdrawn. Graham looked at the document. And the original timeline? It will be attached to the corrected record. He nodded once. No smile. No victory speech. Just relief. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like he was trying to prove he was innocent. The record would speak for itself. As everyone began gathering their papers, Marin stopped him at the door. Are you coming back? Graham looked toward the hallway, where sunlight from the terminal windows fell across the floor. I haven't decided. Marin nodded. Fair enough. Graham walked out carrying the same canvas jacket he had worn when he was fired. He had lost the job. He had not lost the truth. 3 weeks later, Graham stood in his kitchen before sunrise, watching rain slide down the window. While Eli packed his school bag, the house was quiet except for the coffee maker and the soft scrape of a spoon against a cereal bowl. Nothing about the morning looked extraordinary. There was no company car outside, no executive waiting at the door, no envelope filled with money. On the refrigerator, however, was a new document held by a magnet, the corrected personnel record. Graham had read it twice. He didn't need to read it again. The company had officially withdrawn the original termination finding and attached the reconstructed timeline to his file. It stated plainly that the decision had been based on an incomplete sequence of events. That sentence mattered to him more than any apology could have. Eli came into the kitchen wearing a navy hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. Are you flying today? Not today. Tomorrow. Graham smiled, still figuring that out. Eli grabbed his backpack. Are you going to be a pilot again? Graham looked at the rain outside. Maybe, but I might do something different. Eli thought about that. Like what? Something where I get to figure out what happened when things don't make sense. Eli nodded as if that made perfect sense. On the counter beside Graham's coffee sat the old badge marked Viper 01. He had taken it out one last time the night before. It no longer felt like a secret. It was simply part of his history, one small reminder of a skill he had once learned and almost forgotten. The strange thing was that Viper 1 had never made Graham more important than anyone else. It had only made one part of his experience visible at the moment people needed to understand it. That distinction stayed with him. A few days earlier, Marin had called him personally. She had apologized for firing him in public. She had also admitted something harder. I thought because I was responsible for the company, I had to be the person who knew the answer fastest, she had said. I was wrong. Graham had accepted the apology. He hadn't forgotten what happened, but he didn't need to carry anger forever either. He had decided not to return to the same cockpit position immediately. Instead, he had accepted an interview with an independent aviation safety group. It was his choice, not a reward from Marin. And that difference mattered. From a storyteller's point of view, that may be the part worth remembering most. We are often tempted to measure people by what they own, what title appears beneath their name, or how much influence they have in a room. But a person's dignity does not rise and fall with a paycheck. A wealthy executive deserves respect because she is a human being. A working father deserves the same respect because he is a human being. Being poor does not make someone less intelligent, less capable, less worthy of kindness, or less deserving of a fair hearing. Graham had not needed to become richer or more powerful to become worthy of respect. He had been worthy before anyone discovered the old call sign. That was the mistake at the heart of everything that happened. People had looked at a termination report and decided they already knew the man behind it. They had mistaken authority for certainty. Graham hadn't defeated Marin. He hadn't humiliated her in return. He had simply refused to let an incomplete story become the permanent truth about his life. That morning, he drove Eli to school through the cold October rain. At the curb, Eli leaned over and hugged him before getting out. "See you tonight, Dad." Graham smiled. "Always." He watched his son run toward the school doors, then looked at the old Viper badge resting on the passenger seat. He picked it up, turned it over once, and placed it back inside the case. Then he started the truck. He didn't know exactly what came next. For once, he didn't need to. He knew who he was, and that was enough.